heart strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but Thee, dear Lord, none but Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is o'er, time for me will be no more. Guide me gently, safely o'er to Thy kingdom shore, to Thy shore. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon His beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold. When we all get to heaven. What a day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory. I have heard of a land on a faraway strand.
Wonderful story of love,
Tell it to me again.
wonderful story of love.
Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Though you are far away,
Wonderful story of love.
still he doth call today. Calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, ye from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
Wonderful story of love.
Jesus provides a rest
Wonderful story of love.
for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be.
Okay, so we're in section 1 as I'm dividing this, and this opens up from about chapter 1 and verse 16 through about chapter 3 and verse 12, Jesus' ministry that was done in Galilee. Galilee, you'll recall, is the northernmost region of Judea, of Israel, up there in and around the Sea of Galilee. That is where he did much of his teaching. And so that is what Mark is recording, is his time in Galilee and things that he did and said in Galilee. So we're reading here in verse 21, it said that they went into Capernaum. We are told that it was the Sabbath, which is what? What does that mean? Okay, it's a day of rest. And what day was that? The seventh day. It goes all the way back to creation. And then it goes back to an event that happened before the Exodus that God connected to that and then proscribed for them to observe a Sabbath in recognition of his Sabbath. And so that was part of what they were obligated to do. What is happening at this point on the Sabbath is they do what? Immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And so they also, on their weekly holy day, came together and were taught. All right. Does the Old Testament ever talk about a synagogue? So what is this synagogue thing and where did it come from? Anybody? It's a frequent word in the New Testament. Okay, somebody says a place of worship. Sort of, it was a place of worship. Not specifically Jewish worship. I'm just generalizing numbers here. Don't hold me to this, and I haven't actually sat down and counted it out and parsed it. But about, I would say 90% of Jewish worship was practiced in the home. There were certain feast days that they were required to go to Jerusalem and do certain things there. To offer sacrifices, they had to go where? To the temple. Okay, so all of that public stuff, most of the observance of Jewish religion was done at home by families, and don't think about just nuclear 3, 4, 5, 10 people families that made up a single household, but sometimes it included relatives and people that were close by, especially if they didn't have a whole lot of money. For instance, when they observed the Passover, some people might be too poor, and he said to do what? You could go together and you could do this together. And so there was some communal activity, but for the most part, all of that was carried out within the home. So what are these synagogues? Yeah, kind of parallel to what we're doing here right now. Okay, this was a place for them to gather as a local congregation of Jews. And they developed, I think, in large part, and there's a lot of speculation about this among the scholars. Almost everybody says that they arose during the intertestamental period. I don't know that that's completely the case. Maybe it is. But to me, they seem to have arisen in these circumstances where the Jews were scattered. And they're not living among a society that practices all these things. So they come together in congregations. And what goes on there is the public reading of the scripture and teaching. And I'm told through some of the scholarship that it was not uncommon for the teaching to be allowed to be done by visitors to the synagogue. Which is why Paul was so often able to, when he went to a new city, what did he do? He sought out the Jewish synagogue. He went into the synagogue where they were reading the law and studying, and he addressed the crowd. Why? Because they were in the habit of allowing that to happen. What the scholars also say is that what rarely happened was visitors be allowed to read the scriptures, that was always assigned to someone who was actually a member at that synagogue. And in fact, one of the things that they argue to support that is the only time that Jesus is ever recorded as publicly reading the scriptures in a synagogue. Guess where it was at? Nazareth. Which would have been where he grew up and attended synagogue. So think of it kind of as a setting like this. And he goes in, when he gets to Capernaum, it's the Sabbath, and so he assembles. And I don't know that this was something that they only did weekly, by the way. I think it's something that they did on the Sabbath, but I think the implication is that maybe it was done more frequently, because I'm not sure that every time Paul entered into one of these cities that it was the Sabbath day, but yet he constantly went to the synagogue and found people there studying. I think that's why he did it, by the way, because he knew he was going to find religious people, people that were studying the law of God, people that were pursuing God, and a conversation on the topic that he wanted to have. So, but anyway, Jesus goes in there and he begins to teach. Okay? Look at verse 22. And they were astonished at his teaching. For he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. Okay, there's a couple of things I want to talk about in this verse that I think are worth talking about. In order to talk about what I really want to talk about, we got to talk about the end of that verse, not as their scribes. What is that? Why does it say their scribes? Or these scribes, I guess some translations probably say. What were scribes? Okay, that is what we generally think of when we think of the word scribe, and there's a reason for that. And there's all kind of interesting word study that you can do back on the word that's translated from the Hebrew scribe. Now, this was not written in Hebrew, but if you go back into the Hebrew Bible, there is a parallel word to this. I'm told by scholars, because I'm not a Hebrew scholar, that the root of that word actually has something to do with counting. And of course, we've talked a lot about the fact that when the scribes were writing copies of the scrolls, one of the things that they did was count words and count letters to make sure that they had exactly the same thing that they were trying to reproduce. There is an aspect of the scribes, and there was a class of scribes who, in fact, that is what their primary duty was to make these records. But that is not what a scribe was generally, or how it's being used in this verse. The best parallel that we can offer in our experience for the word scribe is scholar. Specifically, we would call them theologians. These were the people who studied closely the law, dug into it, investigated it, thought about it, discussed it among themselves, wrote papers about it. They were educated. They were the educated class. Not everyone could write. That's why they were called scribes, because they could write. And the word scribe apparently began to be a synonym to the idea of wisdom. These were the educated, the scholars of their day. In some places, they're referred to as lawyers. Don't think about attorneys in the sense that we think about attorneys practicing at the bar. These were lawyers of the law of Moses. These were people that studied the law of Moses, that dug into what it all meant, that dug into the word meanings, and then discussed the application of those things, and then went to the synagogues, and after the reading of the scripture, gave the sense of what was just read. They taught. So what is most closely akin in the local church to the scribes would be someone who carefully studies the word of God and then teaches and gives the sense of what it means. A preacher, maybe an elder in some cases. Bible class teachers that are careful about what they do might even fall into that category. But we're talking about the people that they had confidence in. Now, this is what we need. Well, before we talk about that, we need to go to the meat of this and what I really want to talk about in this verse. Immediately, let's see. They were astonished at his teaching, and here's the phrase, for he taught them as one who had authority, not like one of their scribes. what is that really talking about? What do they say about Jesus teaching there?
He would taught them what the Father had said.
Okay. Isn't that what the scribes did? Studied the Word of God and taught them what God said? So how was his teaching different? What made it different? What's actually being said? There's a reason why God inspired Mark to write this and to write it this way. What made his teaching seem, appear, feel, whatever word you want to use, more authoritative than the scribes' teaching?
Scribes were writing down what somebody else said.
Okay, we're getting somewhere. The scribes were writing down and talking and discussing things secondhand.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you a story. It's probably not going to interest you a whole lot, probably not going to interest you as much as it did me the first time I heard it. You don't really care about the players, but I'm going to tell you who they are anyway. There's a point to the story, though, so listen. When I was, I don't know, I probably was a late teen, early adult by the time this conversation happened, but young. I had a conversation with my stepfather. My stepfather worked at a carbon black plant in Orange, Texas. That's what he did for a living. And I'll tell you a little bit of background, and it is important to the story. He started working for Phillips Petroleum. He grew up in the city or the town of Phillips, Texas, which was a company-owned town. And his father worked for Phillips Petroleum Company in Phillips, which isn't there anymore. Phillips built the school, Phillips built the store, Phillips built the town, the roads. They owned all the land. They sold the houses to the employees, but the land that the houses sat on belonged to the plant or to the company. The entire town was a company town. Everything was owned by the company. Everything was financed by the company. He grew up there. He went to work for Phillips right out of high school. And he worked for several years in the gasoline refinery plants in the panhandle of Texas. And then, and I'm guessing, I don't know exactly when the year was, but in the late 60s sometime, he was moved to Orange, Texas to work in the carbon black plant. And he worked at that particular plant till he retired. Now, in the late 80s, when the oil and gas industry was in so much turmoil, that plant turned over and was sold to different companies. But he literally worked in that same chemical plant from the late 60s or very early in the 70s until he retired in the 90s. He outlasted 3 companies at that location. He outlasted, I don't know how many plant managers at that location, but more importantly to the story, and we know a little bit about how engineers work and how the engineering and petrochemical works, he outlasted probably hundreds of engineers that came through there as a way station early in their careers that later had them sent to other areas for the company if they proved to be useful. And he told me this story, that they had regular meetings at the plant that were run by the administrators of the plant manager and those guys. And then there was the engineers that were there, and then the department heads that were there. He was there because he was a department head. And he was in operations. And he worked in that plant for over 30 years, and so he knew it backwards and forwards and inside out. He could tell you where everything was. He could tell you what everything did. He knew about things that nobody else knew about. He had been there longer than most anyone. And he told this story, and he was teaching me a lesson, by the way, in telling the story. He said, we would go to these meetings, and we would have this young crop of engineers in there, and they would say, well, to be more efficient, we need to do this process this way. And he said they would have their charts and their graphs and their paper and their math, and all of this stuff and show how this is a superior way to do this. And he would lean back in his chair and say, it's not going to work. And they would go, what do you mean it's not going to work? Look, it says. And he went, it's not going to work. We did the same thing 20 years ago. It didn't work. That's the difference between being a scholar and studying a book and knowing something firsthand. By the way, most of those engineers discarded him as being uneducated and shouldn't be listened to because they had the knowledge and they knew that it would work. And he would lean back and say, look, that's fine. If you want to do it that way, I'll do it that way. I'm just telling you now, you're not going to get the end result that you're looking for. That's not going to accomplish that. But that's the difference. And so to put it another way, I can read and read and read and study and know all about the instrument of the trumpet and how it works and how it makes sound and everything that you're supposed to do theoretically. That's a very different thing than playing a trumpet. And there's a 5-year-old kid on the street corner in New Orleans that don't know anything about the trumpet or how it works, but he can make it sound a whole lot better than the trumpet scholar. Who do you want to be your teacher? Someone that took brass class in school when they were in undergraduate college and spent 2 weeks on an instrument. Maybe, though. We're going to go on the outside and say they gave them 2 whole weeks to learn the trumpet in this semester brass class where you play all of the brass instruments and get ready. Listen, they know more than the average person on the street about it, and they can make a sound out of it, and they know which buttons to press. But I'm going to tell you something. If you really want to know how to play a trumpet, you go to a guy who's been playing the trumpet for 40 years. That's your teacher. And it's great when that's the guy who also has studied the books and knows that side of it as well. That's when it's really great. That's really what this is talking about. Jesus taught as one having authority because Jesus knew what he was talking about firsthand. He knew about heaven. That's where he came from. He knew about God. That's what he was. He knew about creation. He didn't just study Genesis 1. He did it. He knew about the devil. He knew about hell. He knew about man. He knew more about man than the people he was talking to. He knew more about our motivations. He knew about more about how we would act. You remember that one interchange he had with a group of people very much like this. And he said something, and they said to him, wait a minute. That goes all the way back to Abraham. Are you saying you're greater than Abraham? And he said, before Abraham was, I am. Not only do I know because I read the book, I formed Abraham in his mother's womb. That's why he taught as one having authority. He wasn't simply teaching something secondhand that he had studied and learned. He was speaking the mind of God because he was God. That's the difference between someone who's a first-hand and someone who is offering hearsay. By the way, that's also why we really can't offer a witness. People talk about your Christian witness. You don't have a Christian witness. You study a book. You don't have a testimony. What'd you see? Which gets to the point that's being made by Jesus himself at the end of the Gospel of, I think it's in John that records this event. It may have been one of the other ones. But anyway, you remember Doubting Thomas and the story of Doubting Thomas? And finally, Thomas is there in the room, and finally he touches him, and then he proclaims, and he said, blessed are you, because seeing you believe, but even more blessed are those who what? Believe while not seeing. I can't tell you this is exactly what God said and exactly. I'm just studying it and learning it, and I have to tell you, listen, this is what I believe about this. This is what I understand this to mean. This is how I believe. I can't tell you this is absolute. You know what Jesus could do? This is what it means. One of the big contrasts throughout all the Gospels is the fact that Jesus did things on the Sabbath that the scribes and Pharisees said broke the Sabbath. And he said to them essentially what? No, it doesn't. And you don't know what you're talking about. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the one that made the law. I know exactly what it means. I know exactly what I meant. I know exactly how it applies, and I know exactly what you're thinking. That's the difference between teaching what you study and saying what you know. And when he walked in that room and he taught, they understood that he was not speaking as, well, you know, when I was studying Isaiah, I came to the realization. No, he was saying to them, this is how it is. And they went, this is different. He's got a different air about him. Now, the dangerous thing that happens in this world is that sometimes those scholars think that they have the authority of the practitioners. And Jesus ran into that too. And in fact, when he was teaching about that, he said, listen, these people set themselves in the seat of Moses. And then he told people to do what? Listen to what they say, but don't do what they do. Inasmuch as they are telling you what Moses wrote, they're telling you what God said. Listen to them. But don't become arrogant like them and start thinking that you have authority residing in you. That's what they said in Moses' seat means. Moses was the lawgiver. They acted as they were those having authority, and they didn't have authority. Jesus, however, Jesus had authority, and it was noticed, and they were astonished that he would be so bold and teach in such a way and be so absolute and dogmatic and certain. But then what did he do? Now he cast out a man with an unclean spirit, which was testimony that what? The authority that he was claiming, he actually had. So not only did they hear him teach as one having authority, which astonished them to begin with, but then they saw a demonstration of that authority. Let me show you my authority. If you have any doubts left about whether or not I actually have this authority, and then they saw it. They questioned among themselves. This is down in verse 27. What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. See, he didn't just teach as one claiming authority. He taught as one who actually had authority. That's the difference between your older sibling telling you that dad said it was okay and dad saying it's okay. Because when your older sibling says, oh, dad said it's okay, 9 times out of 10, Dad didn't say it's okay, and they're just trying to do what? Get you in trouble. And I don't care how many times you say it when you face Dad, but he told me you said it was okay. You're not going to get, oh, well then it's fine. So you know what I did when my brother would tell me, oh, Mom said it was okay. I went to Mom and said, hey, he said you said this was okay. Is that what you said? Which, by the way, is a really good practice. When I say something, when I teach something, when anybody says anything or teaches anything about God, don't go, oh, well, that must be what God said. Go ask God. These were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica because they received the word with great eagerness and searched the scriptures to see whether these things were so. I have no authority. I'm like the scribes. I can just study and think and contemplate and say, well, this is what I understand from this. You know what Jesus could say? Do this. Don't do that. And he demonstrated his authority. So it moves from there. That's where we were at, that event last week. But I wanted to talk about that so we get the full import of what's going on here and the full nature of the way Jesus taught. And I guess I'll bring in one more thing that I didn't mention that just came to my mind. I guess one of the ways that we see it demonstrated is in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, and then he would talk about what the scribes taught. But I say to you, and he would talk about how it really applied. That was to, now I'm going to tell you something. If a preacher or Bible class teacher ever stands before you and says, I say to you, you should do this, run away. They don't have the authority to do that. God alone has the right to give commands, to lay down the law. Immediately, so from the synagogue, we're going to move to another thing that happens in the same general time period. I don't think that this word that's translated immediately here actually means at the very instant after this. I think it means in the same time frame and circumstances and connected to it. Immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Okay, these are the 4 that he's called, right? We just learned about them earlier in the chapter. And 2 of them, Simon and Andrew, they're brothers. He goes to their house. Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever. Now, who is Simon? He would be called Peter. Wait a minute, he had a mother-in-law. Well, then what else does that mean? How do you get mothers-in-law? Oh, he had a wife. I'll let you put 2 and 2 together and figure out what the question is about that in this part of the world. But Peter was married. Had a wife, had a mother-in-law, had a family. There are people who would suggest that he had an office that forbids those things. I got a problem with the office. That is foreign to this. I got a problem with the forbidding of those things. That is foreign to this. And I got a problem with assigning Peter to that office when this never does. and he never meets any of those qualifications. He did have some offices. He was an apostle. He was a prophet. His mother-in-law was ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her, and he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Now, I don't know if he said anything or not, but Mark certainly doesn't record it, and the point is that Jesus didn't have to say anything for this fever to leave. He does sometimes say things to people, right? Rise and walk. Was he required to say anything? No, he wasn't even required to be there. In one instance, he healed someone that was in another city. You know what that is? The authority of God. That is what's being laid out here. At the very outset of Mark's gospel, we are seeing what Jesus did to demonstrate his authority. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick. Why did they wait till sundown? Because it was the Sabbath. And what happened at sundown? It wasn't the Sabbath anymore. Now it's the first day of the week. Now they're free. The rest of the people, they've heard. Some of them have seen that were in the synagogue when he was in the synagogue. And now they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons. The two things he had just done, right? Cast out an unclean spirit and heal a sick woman. The whole city was gathered together at the door. What a terrifying thing that must have been for that family. How would you feel if the entire city gathered outside your front door? That's what happens here. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. And I'm out of time, but I really want to talk about that phrase. So next time we're going to start right there with what it means and why we're told that he wouldn't let the demons talk about him. And I appreciate
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea.